I'll now proceed to exercise a rather lengthy discourse on a short history of 19th century reality. I hope you enjoy it, and here it goes. Sit back and enjoy. This one is a long tad bit, although will not be as lengthy as some of my other writings. I please want to first apologize to the listener that I probably will not be looking at the camera for quite some time, so please bear with me. A short history of 19th century reality. It is in five sections. The mechanical revolution, and the relation of the mechanical revolution to the industrial revolution. The second part being the developing of the socialist idea. The third part being socialism in and for human civilization. The fourth part, how Darwinism destroyed religion and political ideas. And fifthly, the rise of nationalism. Preface to the first edition. The fermentation of ideas in the 18th century during the mechanical and industrial revolution of the time. There are two main periods between 1814 and 1914, respectively. 1814 to 1848, in which there was a considerable amount of liberal thinking and writing in limited academical circles, but of no great changes or development of thought in the general masses of people. The dominant liberal ideas, freedom and a vague equalitarianism. The conservative ideas were monarchy, organized religion, and obedience. In America, the revolution had triumphed, and this liberalism remained fairly unchallenged of freedom and equalitarianism. The history of Europe from 1815 to 48 was a sequel to the history of Europe from 1789 to 1814. The main struggle, the interest of humankind against the great power system which oppressed the life of humans. But after 1848, from 1848 to 1914, there began a new phase in the process of mental and political adaptation to the new knowledge and the new material powers of humanity. Humankind was first subjugated into tribal societies by the fear of deity and monarch. Only within the last 4,000 years that humans have any clear evidence that voluntary self-abandonment to some greater and without fee or reward was an acceptable idea to humans, that anyone had propounded it with success. The idea that there is a happiness and self-devotion greater than any personal gratification or individual's triumph, and a life of humankind different and more pertinent than the sum of all the lives within it. This idea is as valid as sunshine caught and reflected in the landscape. Humankind has instinctively understood this new state of mind sometime in its fierce self-centered greed and combativeness of other primates and of Paleolithic family groups, and they have sought to express their thoughts and necessities very variously, finding themselves in conflict and disagreement with older established ideas. The first impatient movement was to declare for a universal equality and a practical anarchy. For human history repeatedly indicates an increasing impulse to revolt against rulers and ownership, but what humans are revolting against is the ruler and employer, who instead of becoming servants of the community still remain self-seeking, oppressive individuals. Part 2, developing the socialist idea for human civilization. This is part 2 and 3. I will get into the mechanical revolution and the industrial revolution, the importance and their differences, existent phenomena. There can be a rearrangement of laws and powers as to give rule and order while still restraining any ruler and any ruling class that might be necessary, and as such a distinction and definition of property so as to give the greatest freedom without oppressive power. Notice the career of Napoleon I in the 19th century histories. He was generally of little significance to the broad strokes of human interests and inquiries. He was an interruption, a reminder of latent vices, and in comparison to a pestilence, killed far fewer people than the influenza pandemic of 1918, and he produced less political and social disruption than the plague of Justinian. But at the least, Europe in general had set aside the individualism of Machiavellian monarchy and declared that it was a human commonwealth. It divided the world among the kings, made respectful gestures towards human unity and in the service of humanity. The permanently effective task upon which the human intelligence is, with many interruptions, engaged is the task of properly constructing and practically applying a science of property as a basis for freedom and social justice, a science of currency to ensure, preserve, an efficient economic standard, a science of government and collective operations, whereby every community in the new societies humans may learn to pursue their common interests in harmony, a science of world politics, through which the warfare between nations may be brought to an end, the common interest of humankind brought under common control, and above all, a worldwide system of education to sustain the desires and interests of humans in their common human knowledge. The real makers of history in the 19th century were those who advanced and contributed to this previously mentioned fivefold constructive effort. Throughout the 19th century, the human mind gathered itself to the task of creative, social, and political reconstruction, when across the globe a wave of universal change in human power and the material conditions of life that the first scientific efforts of a liberated mind that made it possible. Of the accumulating knowledge and confidence concerning the development of science, the most obvious first fruit was the invention of the steam engine. In historical context, the coal mines were being continuously worked by ordinary and well-minded people in order to supply the materials necessary for iron smelting, for which wood charcoal had previously been used. But a man by the name of James Watt improved the steam engine for the deriving of machinery. The first engine to be utilized was installed in 1785. In 1804 CE, Trevithick adapted Watt's engine to support transport and built the first locomotive. In 1825, the first railway was opened, the original engine being locomotive number 1, 1825. By the middle of the century, a complete network of railways had been able to spread across the western parts of Eurasia. When one puts this in historical perspective, Napoleon traveled from Vilna to Paris in 112 hours, 1,400 miles respectively. He traveled with every conceivable advantage and still managed to average a speed of 5 miles an hour. These were the same rates of travel as that between Rome and Gaul in the 1st century CE, or between Sardis and Susa in the 4th century BCE. The railways reduced this journey for an ordinary traveler to less than 48 hours as compared to the previous 312. But this made possible the function of an administrative and academic work in areas 10 times as that had been hitherto before experienced. The steamboat came before the steam engine. In its early phases of development, there was in fact a steamboat, the Charlotte Dundas. On the Firth of Clyde Canal in 1802 and in 1807, the Clermont was traveling upon the Hudson River above the state of New York. The first steamship to be put to sea, the Phoenix, went from New York to Philadelphia. But the first ship to use steam in order to cross the Atlantic Ocean was the Savannah in the year 1819. It was not until the middle of the century that the tonnage of steamships upon the ocean began to surmount that of traditional sailing ships. For the first time in human history, and for human existence for that matter, humans began to cross the seas and oceans with a certainty as to the actual date of arrival. The transatlantic crossing, which took months to cross at most, weeks at the very least, was reduced down to a matter of less than 5 days within a specific hour of arrival. Concurrently with the development of steam transport upon land and sea, a new addition to the faculties of human experience arose as well, due to the investigations of Volta, Galvani, and due to the investigations of Michael Faraday into electrical phenomena, i.e., the electric telegraph was invented in 1835. In just a few years, the telegraph system was being dispersed over civilized parts of the planet. What was once slow news from point to point became practically simultaneous throughout the earth. Obvious to us humans, the steam railway and the electric telegraph of the middle 19th century were the most pertinent and revolutionary of inventions, but they were only first fruits of a far more extensive process. Before the middle of the 18th century, iron was reduced from its ores by means of wood charcoal. It was handled in small pieces, and it was the material of a craftsman who would hammer and wrought it into shape. For both quality and treatment of iron and other metal substances were enormously dependent upon the experience, competence, and sagacity of the individual ironworker. Indeed, metalsmiths did not have the blast furnace until the 18th century, and it was not until this century were historians able to find rolled sheet iron in 1728 and rolled iron rods and bars in 1783. The ancient world, simply due to the fact of its metallurgical inferiority, could not use steam, and therefore the steam engine could not have been possible before sheet iron was available. As late as 1856, the Bessemer process, and presently 1864, the open hearth process, in which steel and every type of iron could be finally melted, purified, and cast in a manner and upon a scale previously unknown. Nothing in the preceding centuries with regard to the practical advances of humankind history is comparable in its consequences to the complete mastery concerning enormous masses of steel and iron and their quality which was now been achieved. Early engines were the first of triumphs, for soon thereafter ships of iron and steel, vast bridges, and a new architectural way of building with steel on a gigantic scale. Process is marked by the intellectual limitations of those who indulge themselves in it. Because of the inventions of the 19th century, coal, iron, and sand could be wrought, molten, and cast to be at last a pinnacle of steel and glass 600 feet above a crowded metropolis. A parallel story could be written concerning the metallurgy of copper and tin, and of a multitude of metals, including nickel and aluminum, unknown before the dawn of the 19th century. It is in this mastery over substances that the main triumphs of the mechanical revolution have been achieved, and indeed we have power, but we still must learn how to use it for the good of humanity. In the late 19th century, witnessed the new science of electricity, and this inquiry began to yield amazing results, such as the electric light and electric traction. The transmutation of forces, the possibility, therefore, to send power that could be converted into mechanical motion, light, or heat through a copper wire. It was the British and the French who were the first leading nations in this great proliferation of knowledge, but the Germans revealed both zeal and pertinacity in scientific inquiries. And though research and experimentation made Britain and France the wealthiest and, one might recall, powerful countries in the world, it did not necessarily contribute to make scientific and inventive humans rich and powerful. For a sincere person of rational inquiry is too preoccupied with their research to plan how to capitalize on profits. Therefore, the economic exploitation of their discoveries is easily and naturally susceptible to the initiatives of the more acquisitive. Ironically, many inventors and discoverers came to the human species only to be taken advantage of the profits made through the cunning of more clever people. The Germans believed that knowledge could be cultivated, for they did concede a significant portion of their public expenditure relatively greater, and in this turn was abundantly rewarded. By the late 19th century, the German people and the researchers thereof made the German language necessary for every science student who wished to keep within the latest work in their particular department. Particularly in the field of chemistry, Germany required a superiority unmatched by Britain and France in technical and industrial prosperity. In history, it is possible to trace the complex network of mental human processes that led to the incessant extension of knowledge and power. To give the student researchers attention to the most salient points of the experience of human progress. The first point is the beginning of systematic inquiry and experiment. The second point being the escape of investigation from ideas of secret knowledge and of personal and individual advantage to the idea of publication and a common knowledge of human experience. Consequences of this thought include many examples, i.e. the foundation of the British Royal Society and the Florentine Society, etc. And these things are the roots of the mechanical revolution, and so long as pure scientific inquiry lives, that revolution will progress. Thus far, the historical record indicates that the exhaustion of wood supply for the ironworks of England led to the eventual use of coal, which led to the development of the pumping engine by Watt, and to a machine-driving engine, which in turn led to the inventions of the locomotive and the steamship. This was the first phase in the great expansion and utilization of steam. The second phase began with the application of electrical science to practical problems and purposes, as well as the development of electrical lighting, power transmission, etc. A third phase was distinguished in the 1880s when the invention of the internal combustion engine would eventually replace steam engines, and these, of course, more efficient engines were applied to the automobile and developed to such efficiency as to render flight a practical achievement, given that it was first projected to be possible. A successful flying machine was invented by Professor Langley of the Smithsonian Institute of Washington in 1897. Also, the year that the birth of quantum physics and compared to classical physics, and also the invention of the X-ray. By 1909, the airplane was then made available for human locomotion in the sky. Remember that in the previous 18th century, the distance from London, England, to Edinburgh, Scotland was a journey of 8 days. In 1918, it was historically reported by the British Civil Air Transport Commission that a journey halfway around the globe would, in a few years' time, be accomplished in 8 days. But the striking speed increasements and reductions in time distances was merely one aspect of a much profounder and much more momentous enlargement of human potentiality and possibility. Indeed, the science of agriculture also made a parallel advancement during the long 19th century. Humans learned to fertilize the soil as to produce quadruple and quintuple the crops from the same area compared to what was produced in the 17th century. And as even more extraordinary and advance also occurred in the medical sciences, the average duration of the human lifespan increased for the first time in human evolutionary existence, and the waste of a life due to ill health diminished. I argue that with such a change in the life of experiences of the human primate species constitutes a brand new phase in human history. And in little more than a single century, humans made a stride in the material conditions of their lives faster than during the Pleistocene and Paleolithic. During the age of growing agricultural civilizations, or between the days of Pepi, 278 BCE in Egypt, and those of George III, 760 to 1820 CE in England. So a new material framework for human endeavors arose in the long 19th century, and it demanded great readjustments of human social, economical, and political methods in the 20th century. Writing in the 21st century, however, a 20th century history will reveal whether or not these demands were realized and acted upon. The Mechanical Revolution. The Mechanical Revolution was an entirely new phenomenon in human experience, arising out of the development of organized science. This phenomenon was a new advance of complexity, a new progression like the invention of language, agriculture, or writing, like the move towards bipedalism or the discovery of metals and elements. But this revolution coexisted along another revolution that had already found a historical precedent, and therefore of a different origin in social and financial development, a phenomenon known as the Industrial Revolution. Now, there would have still been an industrial revolution without a mechanical revolution, but life would resemble social and financial developments, just as was the case in the late Republic of Rome. For the example, the factory method long existed before power and machines. Factories were not the products of machinery, rather they were produced by a division of labor. For another example, there were factories in Rome in the days of Augustus. New books were dictated to many copyists in the factories of the booksellers. The attentive student will realize that the idea of herding impoverished and poor people into establishments to work collectively for their living was in Britain before the close of the 17th century. Mind you that there are intimations of this idea in Thomas More's Utopia of 1615. The Industrial Revolution was a social development. It was not a mechanical development. And since the middle of the 18th century, the social and economic history of Western Europe was in fact tracing the path along which the Roman state had in the last 3 centuries BCE. America was in many aspects a new Spain, India and China a new Egypt. But the political disunions of Europe, the political convulsions against monarchy, the recalcitrance of the common folk, and the greater accessibility of European intelligence to mechanical ideas and inventions turned the process into novel directions. Ideas of human political power turned from the idea of the slave to the idea of the machine. The Mechanical Revolution, the process of mechanical invention and discovery, was a new phenomenon of human experience, and it went on regardless of the social, political, economical, industrial consequences that it might have produced. The Industrial Revolution was and is more profoundly changed and deflected by the constant variation in human conditions caused by the Mechanical Revolution. The power of the old world was human power. Everything depended ultimately upon the driving power of human muscle. A little animal muscle was contributed, at least the ones that humans have domesticated. Of course, the Roman equivalent of the steamship was the galley ship with its many rowers. A vast proportion of humankind in early prehistoric and ancient civilizations worked alone without the help of the machines. At its onset, power-driven machinery did not promise release from unintelligent toil. Great masses of people were employed in building and maintaining canals and railways. Human beings are no longer wanted as a source of mere power. What could be done mechanically by a human being could now be done better and faster by a machine. The human being was needed now only where choice and intelligence had to be exercised. The hard work on which all the previous civilizations had rested, the creature of mere obedience whose brains were superfluous, had become unnecessary to the welfare of humankind. This was true of such an ancient industry as agriculture, as it was of the nearest metallurgical process. Swift machines became forward to do the work of humanity. The entire Roman civilization was built upon cheap and degraded human beings. Modern humans and civilization is being rebuilt now upon cheap mechanical power. And as the 19th century transpired, it became more plain to the intelligent, directive people that the common human needed to be better than the illiterate. They needed to be educated in knowledge of all kinds of crafts to ensure stability, peace, and control in society. The second half of the 19th century was a period of rapid advance in education. Throughout all the westernized world, naturally, there was no parallel advance in the education of the upper classes, and so the great gulf that separated the world into readers and the non-reading mass became little more than a slightly perceptible difference in education level. The mechanical revolution insisted inexorably upon the complete abolition of a totally illiterate class throughout the world. The economic revolution of the Roman Republic had never been clearly apprehended by the common people of Rome. The ordinary Roman citizen never understood the changes through which they lived as clearly and comprehensively as we understand them now. The Industrial Revolution was more distinctly comprehended as one whole process by the common people who would affect, because they would actually read and discuss and communicate as no commonality had ever done before. Massive movements and migrations of ordinary people over considerable areas only became possible as a result of the propagandist religions. Now, we have cited the enthusiasm of the First Crusade as marking a new phase in social history, because before the 19th century, these massive movements were to a great extent comparatively restricted. Every now and then a town artisan would riot, but only locally, for the French Revolution was not the act of a peasantry who had overthrown a government. It was the act of a peasantry released by the overthrow of a government. The mechanical revolution not only pressed education upon the whole population, it led implicitly to a big capitalism and a large-scale reorganization of industry that was to produce a new and distinctive system of ideas in the common people in the place of the merely uncomfortable recalcitrance and primitive rebellions of illiterate commonality. We have noticed that the Industrial Revolution split the manufacturing class into two sections: the employers, who became rich enough to mingle with the financial, and the landowning classes, and the employees who drifted to a status closer to that of a mere laborer. Karl Marx, from 1818 to 1883, did much of his work in the British Museum Library in pointing out that the organization of the working classes by a steadily concentrating group of capitalist owners was developing a new social classification to replace the more complex class systems of the past. Property, so far it was power, was being gathered together into relatively few hands, the hands of the big rich capitalist class, while there was a great mingling of workers with little or no property, the expropriated, who were fated to develop a common conflict of their interests with those of the capitalist class. Differences of education and tradition between the various older social and cultural elements were in process of being fused into the new class of the expropriated. The traditions of the professions, the small employers, the farmer-peasant, were all different from one another and from the various craftsman traditions of the workers. But with the spread of education and the cheapening of good literature and freedom of the press and free inquiry, this, quote, Marxian generalization became more acceptable. These classes were and are being reduced or raised to the same standard of life, forced to read all kinds of excellent books and share the same inconveniences of humanity. A sense of solidarity between poor and propertyless humans is growing more evident in the world today. Success at the upper levels becomes more and more hopeless for the rank and file. The class war of the expropriated mass against the appropriating few is justified by historical events of fact. Now we get to how Darwinism destroyed religion and political ideas. The growth of scientific knowledge from which sprang the mechanical revolution was the moving cause of religious destruction. The record of the rocks, life or the little beginning of consciousness that it is in the still waiting vastness of the void of space-time. This enormous prospect of the past was hidden from the general consciousness of the human race until the end of the 19th century. This was due to the fact that humans were too occupied with their own personal affairs and private passions that they learnt their position in space before they were eventually able to place themselves in time. The historian of modern history is obliged to confine their thoughts to the facts and remember that opinions will altogether be hard to restrain in particular instances. Upon historical assumption rested the religious fabric of civilization, yet the hills, mountains, deltas, and seas were bursting with evidence of its utter absurdity. Religious life was in a house of history built upon sand. Frequent recognition in classical literature is the fact, through the speculations of Lucretius, that Aristotle was aware of the broad principles of modern geology, and he also was the first biologist. But also note that Leonardo da Vinci, in 1452 to 1519, he had an interpretation of fossils and Descartes' speculation in the 16th century upon the incandescent beginnings of our globe, and of a steno, 1631 to 87, who began the first systematic collection of fossils and the description of strata, which we know now as stratigraphy. And so as the 18th century drew to its historical close, the systematic study of geology progressed to the extent as to affect the general ancient religious origin narratives of the axial age. After the establishment of the United States, finalization of the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union in July 1776 to November 1777, the French naturalist Georges Lecomte de Buffon completed upon writing the Epochs of Nature in 1778, boldly extending the age of the Earth to 75,000 years, as opposed to the 4,000-year-old Earth proposed before. It was not until the middle 19th century that the contributions of Hutton, Sir Charles Lyell, Lamarck, and Cuvier had discovered and developed an adequate record of the rocks. It was with great tragedy that the great numbers of honest and religious humans followed the work of English naturalist Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882. In 1859, he published a powerful and permanently valuable exposition of the change and development of species, and in 1781, he brought humans definitively into the same development with the rest of life. And indeed, many men and women among ordinary intelligent people resisted the new knowledge of science instinctively and irrationally. Their whole moral edifice was built upon false history because they were ignorant of prehistoric conditions. Quote, I have certainly said that a human has no reason to be ashamed of being an ape for his ancestor. I should feel ashamed in recalling a human of restless and versatile intellect who plunges into scientific questions with which they have no real acquaintance, only to obscure them by an aimless rhetoric, distract the audience by eloquent digressions, and skilled appeals to prejudice. And that was a quote by Sir Aldous Huxley. The religious theologies and theologians were neither intellectually wise enough nor mentally expanded enough to accept the new truth, and therefore insisted upon the living and undiminished vitality of the religious reality, whose formulae had hitherto sufficed to express. Of course, in all historical ages, ancient to modern, there have been skeptics such as Emperor Frederick II, and in the 18th century, Voltaire was openly anti-religious, and his writings influenced readers, but these people were the exception. In the end, there had been a conflict of science and religion, and in that conflict, science won. The immediate effect of this was very detrimental, simply because the new biological science brought nothing constructive, yet, in order to replace the old religious slave morality. What was once thought to be the gold of religion was discovered as a fool's gold, appealing to people but completely wrong. The old faith of the kings and rulers of the 20th century eventually faded gradually under the actinic light of scientific criticism. Only prevalent in the intellectuals of the late 19th century believed that they prevailed by virtue of the struggle for existence, in which the strong get better of the weak. The true strength of rulers and empires is not in armies and navies, but in the belief that humans are inflexibly open-minded in both truth and legality. Once a government departs from this standard, it ceases to be anything of significant importance, and its days are numbered. The rise of nationalism. All right, this is the rise of nationalism is the last part. Before we get to the Big Five agenda. So, the rise of nationalism indicates that there must be established a normalized political map of the world which gives the best possible geographical divisions for human administrations. I'm going to end this video real quick. It's getting to about 30 minutes. I'll see you in the next one.